So we are almost complete with sewing our beautiful Laura dress that we have hacked the neckline into a keyhole, and we have sewed the side seams in. So what's left? The hem, of course. So just go ahead and neaten up the threads that you see hanging down. I find it helps me to fold away the hem a little bit more neatly. So if you are happy with your dress as it is and you're ready to hem it, go ahead and do that, and then you're going to fold it up a quarter of an inch, and then fold it up another quarter of an inch, and go ahead and hem it. Now the hem of the Laura is a curve, and I find that when I hem curves, I like to just sew in a basting stitch at your first fold line, and what this helps to do is it helps you to ease that curve in and make it simpler for you to, if you need to gather a little or if you need to widen it a little, just help you to hold its place as you are making that second little curve, that second little fold. So it would be a great idea to go ahead and put in a basting stitch at your at your 1/4 inch mark, and then iron it to fold, and then iron to fold again, and then just hem it in. But that's not what I'm going to do today, not for this dress anyway. I am going to be showing you a little hack. So this is what you need to do. So I've got my tape measure here, and what I'm going to do is just to go around the base of the hem and very quickly, or you could take your time, measure the circumference of the hem. So I've got 23 on the front, and I've got 22.5, so you know what, I'm just gonna round it up to 23. I've got 23 on the front and 23 on the back, so that makes 46. And what I'm going to do is I want to create a ruffle hem. I want something that's roughly enough to show the ruffles but not overly ruffly at the same time. So I think I'm going to go and multiply that figure by 2. This is a hack, so you can choose. If you don't want to ruffle it, that's fine. If you just want minimal ruffles, you can take that number and multiply it by 1.5, or if you want something extremely roughly, you can multiply it by 3 as well. It's really up to you. This is a hack, so you can go wild with it. So I'm going to take it as twice the width. So 46 by 2 is 96. Let me just double check that. I'm sorry, it's 92. 46 by 2 is 92. Math on camera isn't my strong point. So I'm going to cut a ruffle. So just a rectangular piece of fabric that's 92 inches long. So unless you have very, very wide fabric, you might need to have it in joints. And because I had only a 3-yard cut of this fabric, I have had to join some fabric together. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So I have this one length of fabric that I managed to cut, and it is exactly 23 inches long, and it is on the fold. So I have exactly the front ruffle, which does not need to be joined by a seam. So this is perfect. I'm going to set this aside, and this is going to be earmarked for the front of the dress. If your fabric is directional, then this is something that you want to take into consideration when you're fabric shopping. If you want to do this ruffle hem hack, then it will definitely require between 1 yard to 2 yards, I think, extra, depending on the depth of your hem and depending on how roughly you want your ruffle hem to be. Just gonna do a real quick measurement of how big these two pieces are. I think they might definitely be longer than 23 inches. So just grabbing my tape measure right here. Oh, perfection. 27-ish. So I'm just going to square that off at 23, and we'll be right back. Here we go. I just want to mention that if you notice, we have not taken into consideration the seam allowances, and that is fine because I'm willing to lose a little bit of the ruffle to the seam allowance. So if you don't want to lose the ruffle to seam allowance, you're going to have to add 2 inches to the total measurement, and that also depends on how many pieces you're cutting it into. So if you have your strip as an entire length, then you would only have to add 1 inch. But if, like me, you have 3 lengths, then you would add a 1/2 inch to each raw short edge. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just tag us in the group and we will help you out with the math if you need any help with this at all. So now I'm going to talk about the width. The width that you choose for your ruffle really depends. In some garments I like a really long and dramatic ruffle, but for this one, because I feel I like it to look short and sassy, so I have a ruffle that is, let me just measure it real quick. I have a ruffle that is, if I'm not mistaken, 6 inches. Yep, I've got 6.5 because I've taken into consideration my hem. So I've got 6.5. So when you pick the depth for your ruffle, remember that 1/2 inch is going to go into the hem of the dress and 1/2 inch is going to go into the hem of the ruffle. So which leaves the remaining hem for this ruffle to be 5.5 inches. So this is a little bit of planning that you have to do beforehand, before you cut into your fabric, to decide how long you want your ruffle to be, how roughly you want it to be, and how deep you want your ruffle to be. So just 2 things to consider, and then we can do the math. So I have my ruffle pieces here. You may have 1 continuous piece. You may have 2, 1 for the front and 1 for the back. Because of my fabric, because I had a lack of this fabric, I have 3 pieces, but that doesn't matter. No matter how many pieces you have, what we want to do is we want to join them at the short edges so that they form 1 continuous loop. There's 2 ways that you could do this. You could either serge and stitch down there. If you were doing your ruffle in knit, then serging would just be adequate. If you're doing it in woven, you need to stitch it and then finish off the seams. But because I've done the rest of the garment in French seams, I am going to French seam this ruffle as well. So how I do that is the same way that I've done for the rest of the garment. So I'm going to stitch the short edges together with wrong sides facing, 1/4 inch for all. So I've got 4 raw edges, 4 seams to make. So I'm going to sew this in wrong sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here we go, that's all done. That's my side seam, my cinder back, and my other side seam. So I'm going to come at it with a pair of shears and just trim off half of that seam allowance. And after this, it's off to the ironing board just to make sure that it turns nice and neat. And then we will be sewing the next seam the same way, 1/4 inch just down each of the sides that you have, such that your ruffle piece now forms 1 continuous large loop. So off to the ironing board, press your seam, clip it, and stitch it in with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here we go, all 3 side seams complete with beautiful French seams. So now that that's done, go ahead and snip off any excess thread. And when we're doing a ruffle, I find that the easiest thing to do is to hem it first and then to go ahead and ruffle it. So after we're done with snipping off all these excess threads, what we're going to do is, here we have one massive ruffle. So what we're going to do right now is to fold it under a 1/4 of an inch, and then another 1/4 of an inch, and we are going to hem the ruffle the entire length of it, and then we're going to come back to do our gathering stitches. And of course, at this point, you could choose any hem application that you'd like. What is recommended by the tutorial is the standard 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch fold, and then to edge stitch it. Alternatively, you could serge off the edges and apply some trim. The option's really yours. So many different applications that you could do to the hem to finish off the hem. For this, we're just going to go ahead and do our double fold and edge stitch just to finish off, so we can continue on with our ruffle. So here I have my entire ruffle all nice and pretty with its hem all done up. And now what that leaves for me to do is the gathering stitches right at the top. Let's talk about gathering stitches. We all have our quirks when we sew, and I find what I like to do is have a separate row of gathering stitches for the front of the ruffle and a separate row of gathering stitches for the back of the ruffle. And what that helps me is to demarcate the ruffles for the front of the garment versus the back of the garment. It helps me, I feel, spread out the ruffles a little bit more evenly. It could just be a mental marker, I'm not sure, but that's just one of my sewing quirks. Another thing that is a very handy tip is to use a different color thread for your bobbin, so that you can, it helps you differentiate which thread you're going to pull. And we always gather from the bobbin thread because it's easier to pull out the bobbin thread than it is to gather with the top thread. So these are some of the tips that are useful to keep in mind when you are getting ready to do your gathering stitches. And of course, the necessary, don't forget to increase your stitch length to the maximum setting and to increase your tension to the maximum setting of your machine as well. So I'm going to head over to my sewing machine now, and I will be running 2 rows of basting stitches. The first of which will be a 1/4 inch from the seam allowance, and the next of which will be 5/8 inch from the seam allowance, and the purpose of which is to hold the gathers in between the seam line. So my seam line will be a 1/2 inch as per this whole entire pattern. So one gathering stitch will be at a 1/4 inch, and the next one will be at the 5/8 inch mark. So we're getting started, and just a reminder that our tension dial is at its largest possible setting. Your stitch length is at its largest possible setting, and I've changed my bobbin thread to red color so I can see it very clearly as I need to gather it and remove it later. I have also made sure that I have a fully wound bobbin down there, because if you remember, our loop is about, for my size, it's about 92 inches, well 90 inches now that I've taken 90-ish inches because I've taken out a fair bit in seam allowances, but still that's a long length. So I have a fully wound bobbin down there, and I'm gonna go ahead and put in my first row of stitches at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And what I'm going to be doing is starting and stopping at the side seams. Remember, we are not going to backstitch. So here I have reached my side seam. What I'm going to do is lift up the presser foot and leave a long tail. Snip that off. And I pick up my seam right past the side seam. And I continue for the remainder of the length. And here I am back at the starting point, so that's the start of my gathering stitch. So once again, I want to leave a very long tail. And And I'm going to go ahead and do the same steps, starting and stopping at the side seams for the 5/8 seam allowance mark. And as you are sewing in your 5/8 gathering stitch, 5/8 inch gathering stitch, pardon me, you will find that the top stitch looks like it's coming loose, but it actually isn't. We will see in the end result that it just remains just as gathered. Okay, so here we have our ruffle all done up, nice and gathered, and what I want to show you is how much this has shrunk. So we had about, I'd say about 90 inches of fabric in a loop just now after doing in the seam allowances, and now we have gathered it down to just about 17. So we do have to stretch it a little bit to fit our front and back of the dress, because as we measured it just now, it was 23 inches. So we're going to do that on the dress. There's my center back, this is my front, and here's what I'm going to do to help me identify the front. I'm going to put a clip in the center front of the hem, and that's going to let me know that this is the front of the ruffle, the ruffle that goes in the front of the dress. So what we need to next is to bring our dress, and here's our Laura dress nicely laid out. Now if you wish, you could put a ruffle on the hem of the top as well. I think it would be really cute. So remember that little clip that we put in the front just now? So the ruffle goes in this way. So the first thing I need to do is identify where my side seams are. So that bit is going in the front. Side seam. Match it to the side seam of your dress. And this is one of those instances where, you know, sometimes we choose between clips and pins. This is one of those instances where I just prefer to use pins because I feel they hold everything in just a little bit more securely and doesn't allow anything to shift around. So I've got one side seam pinned in. Looking at my other side seam, that goes on the left side of my garment. So because I have a center back seam, and if you do, you can choose to align this part of your ruffle to the center back seam as well. So I'm just going to pop a pin there just as a visual reminder that that is my center back. So we have this much ruffle to go across that much fabric. So take a minute now to just smooth out the ruffles and pin accordingly. And when you're done, you're happy with how your ruffles are spread out, and you're happy with how even the look is. Okay, I've got a bit of a tangle here. I'll go sort that out in a minute. So then what you need to do is you need to loop the ends of your gathering thread around the pin. I'll show you that in a minute. So we've gone around the whole circumference of the hem and pin everything neatly in place. Now that this is nice and firmly in place, I'm going to go stitch this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now your seam allowance should come exactly between these two gathering lines, and the reason we put the gathering lines at 1/4 and 5/8 is so that the gathers hold as we are stitching our permanent seam in place. These two gathering lines will be removed. You can remove this, the 1/4 inch one, if you choose to. If you don't want it, if you don't want to remove it, you can leave it in there. We're going to be finishing this seam later when we come back, but first things first, we're going to put in the permanent seam here, right in the middle of these two gathering stitches. So coming back from gathering, do not forget to readjust your tension dial, and do not forget to change your stitch length. As your gathers go under the presser foot, I like to just press them down from both sides as well, just to make sure that there are no puckers and that, you know, it's coming out nice and gathered. I know that's what the pins are there for, but it pays off to just be a little bit prudent as they're going in as well, because sometimes they can bunch up like we have over here. So just before it goes under, just even it out as you are as you're sewing them, so that you get a more even gather along the way. So we're gonna get started just slightly off the side seam. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with these little nests of thread that we've created on the side seams. I'm going to show you what I do with that. So now that this is the permanent stitch, don't forget to lock stitch. So before the nested bit goes under the presser foot, I'm going to remove that pin, and I'm going to remove that nest of threads just to open it up, and then do the same for the other one. So this just makes it a little bit easier to as you're going to unpick later. So now we go on to stitch it as per normal. Here we have it all attached, but we have so many threads flying around, so just take a minute to unpick all those threads, especially at the side seams. Now this is also a good time to think about how we want to finish that raw hem. So we could finish off the seam allowance in a number of ways. We could serge that and then top stitch it to the bodice, or you could also encase it, just trim it down in half and encase it in some bias binding. That would be beautiful too. For this hack, I am going to serge it, so first things first, I just want to remove all those spare threads. If you chose to finish up the seams with some bias tape, what you would do now is to trim down the seam allowance by about half, perhaps to 1/4 of an inch, and then you can just go ahead and bind it up with some pretty bias binding. I will not be doing the bias binding method today. I am going to go ahead and run this seam under a serger, and then I'm going to top stitch it upwards towards the bodice. Okay, now that I have serged the edge nice and neat, I am going to top stitch from the right side of my garment. So I will start, let me find the side seam. Side seam is over there. As I am stitching, I want to be pushing the seam up towards the bodice, and I will be stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the seam. So from the seam that joins the hem of the dress to the ruffle, 1/8 of an inch on the dress side. Here you have it, all done. Now all that remains is for me to give it a good press, and I'm going to try it on. Well done, you're all finished. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being with us. We hope you've enjoyed the sew. If you're stuck at any point, don't worry. Just hop on over to either the Rebecca Page Sewing Facebook group or the RP Sewalongs group and post your questions, comments, or your beautiful makes. We love to see what you create, and we love to help you if you're stuck at any point of the way. We thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure sewing with you, and we look forward to the next sew along. Goodbye!